August 8, 1944. A young British soldier named Joe Ekins peers through his gun sight at 3 German Tiger tanks crossing an open field near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil. He has never fired his gun in combat, not once. The Fireflies had only arrived 6 weeks before deployment, and Ekins had been to the firing range exactly 1 time. Now, at 800 yards, he watches the most feared tanks in the world roll toward his position. His heart pounds against his ribs, sweat drips into his eyes. His commander gives the order, "Fire." What happens next will kill Germany's greatest tank ace and prove that British ingenuity had created the only Allied weapon capable of stopping Hitler's armored monsters head-on. This is the story of how a gun the British government almost refused to build became the most feared weapon in Normandy. The year was 1940, and Britain was alone. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk, but they had left nearly all their equipment behind on the beaches. Over 2,000 artillery pieces abandoned, nearly 700 tanks lost, 65,000 vehicles left rusting on French soil or captured by German forces. The situation was not merely desperate, it was catastrophic. Britain's army had escaped, but an army without equipment is just a collection of men. Yet even as Britain scrambled to replace what had been lost, a small group of weapons designers at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich were already thinking ahead, not about the tanks they faced today, but about the tanks Germany would build tomorrow. It was a remarkable act of foresight in a nation fighting for survival. The QF 6-pounder anti-tank gun was still on the drawing board in late 1940. It would not enter production until 1942, but British intelligence officers studying captured German equipment had noticed something troubling. German armor was getting thicker. The Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks that had swept through France carried armor that British 2-pounder guns could barely scratch at reasonable combat ranges, and reports filtering back from the Eastern Front, where Germany had just invaded the Soviet Union, suggested that even heavier tanks were being developed. Something massive was coming. In November 1940, during a meeting in London, a radical proposal emerged. Britain needed to skip an entire generation of anti-tank weapons. Before the 6-pounder had even been tested, they should begin designing its replacement, a gun powerful enough to destroy any tank the Germans might build for the rest of the war. The committee agreed. Work would begin immediately. The specifications were ambitious. The new gun would need to penetrate 120 to 150 millimeters of armor at 730 meters. In 1940, no tank in the world carried armor that thick. The designers at Woolwich were building a weapon for a war that did not yet exist, against tanks that existed only in German engineering offices. By May 1941, the Ordnance Committee had finalized the design. The new gun would fire a 17-pound shell, giving it the name that would become legend. The QF 17-pounder would be 3 inches in caliber, 76.2 millimeters, with a barrel 55 calibers long. The shell would leave the muzzle at over 900 meters per second, faster than any anti-tank gun then in service. With specialized discarding sabot ammunition still being developed, velocity would exceed 1,200 meters per second. The numbers were staggering. Using standard armor-piercing capped ammunition, the 17-pounder could penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and 119 millimeters at 1,000 meters. With the new discarding sabot rounds, penetration exceeded 250 millimeters at 500 meters, enough to punch through the front of any tank Germany had or was likely to build. But there was a problem. The gun existed. The tanks it was meant to destroy did not yet exist in significant numbers, and Britain's military establishment, overwhelmed by the demands of fighting a global war, saw no reason to rush production of a weapon designed to kill tanks that might never materialize. Then came Tunisia. In November 1942, the first Tiger tanks arrived in North Africa with German Heavy Tank Battalion 501. British tank crews received their first glimpse of the monster they would face for the rest of the war. The Tiger I carried 100 millimeters of frontal armor, enough to stop every anti-tank gun the Allies possessed at standard combat ranges. Its 88 millimeter main gun, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft weapon, could destroy a Sherman tank at 2,000 meters, well beyond the range at which Allied tanks could reply. The effect on Allied tank crews was immediate and devastating. Reports flooded back describing one-sided engagements where British and American tanks were picked off at extreme range, unable to even damage the Tigers bearing down on them. Tank crews watched helplessly as their shells bounced off Tiger armor like pebbles off a boulder. One Tiger could hold off an entire squadron. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Men began to fear an enemy they could not hurt. British intelligence panicked. The 17-pounder had been in development since 1941, but production of its specialized carriage had been delayed. The gun existed, sitting in warehouses. The carriage did not. And now men were dying because bureaucracy had failed to anticipate what British designers had predicted years earlier. The solution was desperate but effective. 117-pounder guns were airlifted to North Africa and mounted on the carriages of 25-pounder field howitzers. These hybrid weapons, codenamed Pheasant, entered combat in February 1943, the first 17-pounders to face the enemy. They worked. For the first time, Allied gunners watched their shells punch clean through Tiger armor at ranges where they could actually aim and hit. But the Pheasant was a stopgap. What the army really needed was the 17-pounder mounted in a tank. In a tank, it could maneuver with armored formations. It could exploit gaps in enemy lines. It could hunt tigers instead of waiting for tigers to come to it. This is where the story takes a strange turn, because the British government had a plan for mounting the 17-pounder in tanks, and that plan was failing spectacularly. The Cromwell tank was supposed to be Britain's new medium tank, armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun that would outclass the Sherman. The A-30 Challenger was supposed to carry the 17-pounder on a modified Cromwell chassis. These were the official projects, backed by the Ministry of Supply and the Department of Tank Design. Millions of pounds had been allocated. Factories had been prepared. Together, these tanks would give Britain the armored firepower to match Germany. But the Cromwell's turret ring proved too small for the high-velocity 75mm gun it was supposed to carry. It would have to be armed with a less powerful weapon. And the Challenger was plagued by mechanical problems. Its elongated hull made it unreliable, top-heavy, and difficult to maintain in the field. Tank crews who tested it complained bitterly. By early 1943, it was becoming clear that neither design would be ready in time for the invasion of Europe. Meanwhile, at the Lulworth Armoured Fighting School in Dorset, a major named George Brighty was conducting unauthorized experiments that would change the war. Brighty was convinced that the Sherman tank was the answer. The Sherman was reliable, far more reliable than any British tank design. It was available in enormous quantities through Lend-Lease, with American factories producing thousands every month. And critically, it had a turret ring large enough to potentially accommodate the 17-pounder. The official position was that mounting such a large gun in the Sherman was impossible. The recoil was too violent, the turret too cramped, the whole concept impractical. Brighty disagreed. His first attempt was crude. He removed the recoil system entirely and locked the gun in place, forcing the entire tank to absorb the shock of firing. It was absurd. It was dangerous. The suspension groaned. The transmission complained. But technically, it worked. The gun fired. The tank survived. Whether the suspension and transmission would last under such abuse remained an open question. In June 1943, Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge arrived at Lulworth. Witheridge was a veteran of the North African campaign who had been blown out of his Grant tank at the Battle of Gazala and declared unfit for combat duty. He had spent 6 months at Fort Knox advising American tank crews on gunnery techniques, and he had become convinced of the Sherman's virtues, its mechanical reliability, its ergonomic layout, its potential for improvement. When he saw what Brighty was attempting, he immediately joined the effort. Together they refined the design. Witheridge proposed a new recoil system using stacked recuperators mounted on either side of the gun, allowing it to fit within the Sherman's turret. The gun would have to be rotated 90 degrees, mounted on its side, to accommodate the massive breech. The co-driver position would be eliminated entirely to make room for the 17-pounder's larger ammunition. A new hatch would be cut into the turret for the loader, who would otherwise be trapped if the tank caught fire. It was unconventional, it was improvised, and it just might work. Then came the order to stop. The Department of Tank Design sent a directive to Brighty and Witheridge, instructing them to cease their efforts immediately. The official projects, the Cromwell and Challenger, were proceeding on schedule. Resources should not be diverted to unauthorized experiments. The message was clear: follow orders and wait for the proper solution. Witheridge refused to comply. Using his connections to Major General Raymond Briggs, the former commander of the 1st Armoured Division in North Africa and now director of the Royal Armoured Corps, Witheridge lobbied Claude Gibb, the Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply. Gibb was skeptical but willing to listen. He made inquiries and discovered that a Colonel William Watson had recently returned from Australia, where the 17-pounder had been successfully mounted in the Australian AC-1 Sentinel tank. If the Australians could do it, why could the British not do the same with the Sherman? By October 1943, the unauthorized project had official backing. The prototype was handed over to professional tank developers. A Vickers engineer named W.G.K. Kilbourne solved the recoil problem definitively, designing a compact system that allowed the massive gun to function reliably within the Sherman's turret. By February 1944, before final testing was even complete, an order was placed for 2,100 conversions. The reason for the rush was simple and terrifying. The Challenger would not be ready for Normandy. The Cromwell could not carry the 17-pounder. Every other British tank design was years from production. The Sherman Firefly, born of unauthorized experiments and bureaucratic defiance, was the only tank that could give British crews a fighting chance against German armor when the invasion came. Winston Churchill himself declared the program highest priority. The nickname Firefly came from the weapon's most distinctive and dangerous feature. When fired, the 17-pounder produced a muzzle flash so brilliant that both gunner and commander had to blink at the moment of firing or risk being blinded for several seconds. The flash was so intense that hedgerows and undergrowth in front of the tank would often catch fire after just a few shots. Veteran Ken Toot of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry described it vividly: the immense breach, the massive shells, the blinding flash that could leave you staring at afterimages while enemy tanks maneuvered for the kill. The Firefly that Joe Ekins climbed into on the morning of August 8, 1944, was one of these improvised weapons. His tank, named Velikia Luki after a Russian city, was part of 3-troop a squadron, 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, attached to the 33rd Armoured Brigade. The squadron had advanced overnight to the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cramanil as part of Operation Totalize, the Canadian-led offensive to break through German lines south of Caen and capture the strategic heights near Falaise. Ekins was 21 years old. Before the war, he had worked in a shoe factory in Rushden, Northamptonshire, a small town where nothing much ever happened. He had volunteered for the army at 17, feeling it was his moral obligation to fight the Nazis. His training as a gunner had been minimal at best. The Fireflies had arrived only 6 weeks before deployment, and ammunition for the 17-pounder was too scarce for extensive practice. He had fired the gun exactly once on a training range, 5 rounds total. Now he sat in an orchard on the edge of a wood called Delle de la Roque, watching an open field through his gun sight, waiting for Germans to appear. The morning passed slowly. Bombers droned overhead, pounding German positions to the south. The ground shook with distant explosions. Ekins and his crew ate their rations, checked their equipment, and tried not to think about what was coming. The inside of the Sherman smelled of oil, sweat, and fear, the particular odor of men who know they might die before sunset. They came around midday. 7 Tiger tanks of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion rolled north across the open ground, counterattacking the Allied advance that threatened to encircle German forces near Caen. From their position in the orchard, screened by hedgerows and trees, Ekins and his crew could see only 3 of them. The rest were hidden by the rolling terrain and scattered woods. But 3 Tigers were more than enough to destroy their entire troop if they closed the distance. The commander of Ekins's tank was Sergeant Douglas Gordon, a steady man who had seen enough combat to know when to wait and when to act. He watched the Tigers approach through his periscope, calculating distance and angle. The Tigers were moving in a loose line, spread across the field to avoid presenting a bunched target for artillery or air attack. Their long 88mm guns swept back and forth, searching for threats. At 1,200 yards, the Tigers were too far for a reliable shot. At 1,000 yards, still too far, the 17-pounder was accurate, but at that range against a moving target, misses were likely, and a miss would reveal their position. Gordon waited. The tanks kept coming, their tracks throwing up dust and grass in the August heat. At 800 yards, Gordon gave the order: the rearmost Tiger first, standard doctrine to prevent the lead tanks from reversing to safety behind their burning comrade. Ekins aligned his gun sight on the Tiger's flank. The tank was moving at perhaps 15 kilometers per hour, enough to require a slight lead. At 800 yards, the Tiger filled his optics, a massive rectangle of grey steel and deadly intent. He could see the commander standing in the turret hatch, scanning for threats. He pressed the firing pedal. The Firefly lurched backward with the recoil. The 17-pounder's report was deafening even through the tank's armor, a physical blow that rattled Ekins's teeth and left his ears ringing. The muzzle flash lit up the orchard like lightning, throwing sharp shadows against the trees. Smoke and dust billowed around the tank, momentarily obscuring vision, and through the clearing smoke, Ekins saw the shell strike home. The Tiger shuddered as if it had been punched by a giant fist. Fire erupted from its engine deck, orange flames and black smoke boiling into the sky. A clean penetration. The armor-piercing round had punched through 80mm of side armor at a slight angle, exactly as the Woolwich designers had intended. The crew did not bail out. Whether they were killed instantly or trapped by fire, Ekins never knew. Gordon shouted for another round. The loader, a man whose name history has forgotten, worked frantically in the cramped turret, muscling another 17-pound shell into the breech. The round was over 2 feet long and weighed as much as a small child. Loading it quickly required strength, training, and practice, and the crew had barely had any practice at all. But the shell slammed home, the breech closed, the gun was ready. But now the other Tigers had seen them. The lead Tiger's turret was already swinging toward their position, its 88mm gun seeking them out. A shell screamed past the Firefly, close enough to rattle every man in the tank, and exploded somewhere in the orchard behind them. Another struck the turret front with a tremendous clang, spraying sparks and fragments but failing to penetrate. The Firefly's armor held, barely. Gordon was hit. Shrapnel or debris from the turret impact caught him, and he scrambled out of the commander's hatch, blood on his uniform. Lieutenant James, commanding the troop from another tank, saw what had happened. He sprinted across open ground through German fire, dodging between shell bursts and machine gun tracers, and climbed into the Firefly to take Gordon's place. Within minutes of the engagement beginning, the tank had a new commander. James ordered Ekins to engage the second Tiger immediately. The second Tiger had turned toward them now, presenting its frontal armor, 100 millimeters of hardened steel sloped to deflect incoming rounds. A standard Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate that armor at any range short of point blank. The shell would simply bounce off, announcing the Sherman's position while accomplishing nothing. Thousands of Allied tankers had died learning this lesson, but Ekins was not firing a 75. He tracked the Tiger as it turned, waiting for the hull side to come into view where the armor was thinner. The Tiger commander was skilled. He kept turning, trying to present his strongest armor while his gunner lined up a shot. For a moment, the two tanks dueled, each trying to catch the other at a disadvantage. Ekins fired just as the Tiger completed its turn. The shell caught the tank where the side armor met the front, penetrating at an angle. Another eruption of flame. The Tiger's ammunition detonated with a catastrophic explosion, throwing its 17-ton turret into the air like a bottle cap. The turret landed upside down several yards from the burning hull. No one inside could have survived. Two Tigers down, one remained. The third Tiger was moving erratically now, seeking cover, its commander clearly aware that something was very wrong. His two companions had been destroyed in less than 5 minutes, by an enemy he could not even see clearly. But there was no cover on that open field, just grass and dust and the burning wrecks of his comrades. Ekins tracked the tank through his gun sight, leading it slightly to compensate for its frantic movement. His first shot missed, kicking up dirt and debris to the Tiger's right. He adjusted, calculated, and fired again. The fourth shot struck the Tiger's rear, penetrating the thinner armor over the engine. The tank slewed to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew bailed out, fleeing across the field as their tank burned behind them. 3 men running through the grass, leaving their monster to die. 3 Tigers destroyed in approximately 12 minutes. Joe Ekins, in his first combat engagement, having fired a total of 5 rounds, the same number he had fired on the training range, had just accomplished something no Allied tank crew had done before. What Ekins did not know, could not have known in the chaos and noise and terror of battle, was that one of those Tigers carried the most famous tank commander in the German army. Tiger number 007 was commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann. 2 months earlier, at Villers-Bocage, Wittmann had achieved what German propaganda called the greatest tank action in history. Attacking alone in his Tiger, he had destroyed 14 British tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns in approximately 15 minutes. His single-tank assault had halted the entire 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats who had fought Rommel across North Africa, and thrown the British offensive into chaos. Wittmann had received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations from Hitler himself. Nazi propaganda had made him a household name across the Reich, the embodiment of Germanic warrior spirit, proof that individual courage and skill could overcome Allied material superiority. His face appeared on recruitment posters. His exploits filled newsreels. German schoolchildren knew his name. Now he was dead. His tank's turret, blown free by the ammunition explosion, lay upside down several yards from the burning hull. Wittmann and his entire crew, men who had fought from the Eastern Front to Normandy, who had destroyed over 150 Allied vehicles between them, remained inside, killed instantly by the detonation of their own ammunition. The irony was almost too perfect. Germany's greatest tank ace, credited with over 130 Allied vehicles destroyed, had been killed by a British gunner who had never fired in combat before that day, killed by a weapon that British bureaucrats had ordered its creators to stop building, killed by a tank that existed only because 2 stubborn officers had refused to follow orders. Later that same day, during a German counterattack, Ekins's Firefly was knocked out. He destroyed a Panzer IV before his tank was hit by enemy fire, forcing the crew to bail out into the August heat and crawl to safety through grass that smelled of smoke and burning oil. Ekins was reassigned to another Sherman tank as a radio operator. His days as a gunner were over. He had fired his 17-pounder in combat for approximately 12 minutes total. In that time, he had destroyed 4 German tanks, including 3 Tigers. The Firefly, that should not have existed, had killed the ace who was supposed to be invincible. The German reaction to the Firefly told the whole story. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, German tank crews had learned to identify the distinctive long-barreled Sherman and prioritize it above all other targets. Standing orders went out to every Panzer unit in France: engage Fireflies first, before any other Allied vehicle. The reasoning was simple and terrifying. The Firefly was the only Allied tank that could kill a Tiger or Panther from the front at standard combat ranges. Every other Sherman was an annoyance. The Firefly Firefly was death. British crews responded by camouflaging their weapons. False muzzle brakes were fitted halfway along the barrel, and the exposed portion forward of the fake brake was painted in countershading patterns to make the gun appear shorter. From a distance, a camouflaged Firefly might be mistaken for a standard 75mm Sherman, a deception that sometimes bought precious seconds in an engagement long enough to get off the first shot. But the deception could not hide the Firefly's effectiveness. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the statistics spoke for themselves. The 17-pounder could penetrate 174mm of armor at 100 meters and 150mm at 1,000 meters using standard ammunition. With discarding sabot rounds, those figures exceeded 250mm, enough to punch through the frontal armor of any German tank in service, including the fearsome King Tiger. Think about that contrast. The standard Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate approximately 63mm of armor at 1,000 meters. It could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any range, period. Sherman crews facing Tigers had to get around to the side or rear to have any chance of a kill, and getting around a Tiger meant driving past its 88mm gun, which could destroy you at 2,000 meters. The mathematics of these engagements were heavily weighted toward the Germans. The 17-pounder changed those mathematics. It could punch through more than twice as much armor as the 75, and do it at distances where Sherman crews would normally be helpless targets. A Firefly could kill a Tiger head-on at 1,000 meters. It could kill a Panther at 1,200 meters. It transformed the survival odds for every crew in its troop. The Firefly was not perfect. No weapon ever is. The elimination of the co-driver reduced the crew from 5 men to 4, increasing workload during combat operations. The larger 17-pounder ammunition reduced the number of rounds carried from 90 to 77. The spectacular muzzle flash gave away positions and could temporarily blind the crew, leaving them vulnerable in the critical seconds after firing. And the high explosive shells available for the 17-pounder contained less explosive filler than standard 75 shells, making the Firefly less useful against infantry, bunkers, and fortifications. But for one specific purpose, killing German heavy tanks, nothing in the Allied arsenal came close. Lieutenant G.K. Henry, commanding a Firefly defending the village of Nory-on-Besson, destroyed 5 Panthers with 6 shots during a German counterattack. Sergeant Harris of the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards destroyed 5 Panthers with 5 shots during Operation Perch. These were not isolated incidents or lucky shots. The 17-pounder simply worked. By the end of the war, between 2,100 and 2,200 Fireflies had been built. They served with British, Canadian, Polish, Czechoslovak, New Zealand, and South African forces from Normandy to the Rhine and beyond. The Americans, initially skeptical of British tank modifications and confident in their own 76mm gun, eventually requested Fireflies for their own armored units, though supply constraints and the approaching end of the war meant few were delivered before Germany surrendered. The 17-pounder itself continued in service long after 1945. It was used in Korea, where it proved effective against North Korean and Chinese armor. Its basic design principles influenced the development of the British 20-pounder and eventually the legendary L7 105mm gun that armed NATO tanks from the Centurion to the M60 pattern for decades. But the Firefly's real legacy was simpler than specifications and penetration tables. It was the knowledge that British engineers, working against official resistance and institutional inertia, had predicted what the war would require and built the weapon to meet it. In late 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and the Tiger tank existed only in German engineering offices, designers at Woolwich had begun work on the gun that would destroy it. When bureaucrats ordered the project stopped, 2 stubborn officers kept working. When official tank designs failed, an improvised solution proved superior. When Germany's greatest tank case led his Tigers against British positions, a 21-year-old shoe factory worker killed him with his first shots in combat. Joe Ekins returned to Rushden after the war. He went back to work in the shoe factory, married his childhood sweetheart, and became a manager. He rarely spoke of August 8, 1944. When asked about killing Wittmann, he was characteristically blunt. He accepted the doctrines of Hitler enough to get in his tank and invade other people's countries, country after country, to kill men, women, and children. He might have been a hero to the Germans, but not to me. Ekins died on February 1, 2012, at the age of 88. His tank, Velikie Luki, was lost to history, one of hundreds of Fireflies destroyed, worn out, or scrapped during and after the war. But his achievement remained in the historical record, studied by military historians, debated by armchair generals, remembered by those who understand what courage looks like. That is why German tank crews feared the 17-pounder more than any Allied gun, not because of specifications or penetration tables or muzzle velocities, but because British character, the refusal to accept official limitations, the stubborn persistence against bureaucratic resistance, the willingness to improvise when official solutions failed, had created the one weapon Germany's armor could not defeat. That is not propaganda. That is 76.2 millimeters of high-velocity steel doing exactly what the designers at Woolwich intended it to do: kill tigers.